Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her notes lay untouched before her, the echo of her final sentence still vibrating in the marble air. You could feel the gravity of it, truth landing like thunder without a sound. Cameras clicked. A cough somewhere in the gallery broke the spell. And then the moment spread. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the hush that follows brilliance. But that silence wasn't born from ease. It was wrestled from tension. Only hours earlier, whispers had filled this very room. Skepticism, condescension. "She's out of her depth," one aide had murmured, confident behind a smirk. They'd expected another performance of arrogance disguised as authority. Another day where power spoke over reason. Instead, they got a reckoning. The headlines wouldn't capture the weight of that nod. They'd say Justice Roberts applauds or courtroom stuns as Crockett commands silence. But none of those words would describe what it felt like to witness composure, triumph over contempt. For those who sat in the chamber, it wasn't just law, it was dignity, embodied and undeniable. And yet, before the calm there had been chaos. Before the applause, resistance. The path to this quiet victory ran through disbelief, defiance, and the raw nerve of confrontation. How did a young congresswoman, doubted and dismissed, bring the nation's highest legal mind to stillness? What truth did she wield that cut through decades of decorum and dominance? Because this wasn't just a hearing. It was a mirror, a reckoning with what America pretends to value and what it truly respects when the masks fall away. The silence broke only with a breath. Crockett's eyes lifted, meeting the Chief Justice's for the briefest second. No triumph, no smirk, just acknowledgement. The kind that changes everything. But before the applause there was disbelief, resistance, and a clash that no one saw coming. The headlines hit before dawn. The ethics inquiry that could split the bench. By noon, the marble steps of the Supreme Court looked like a movie premiere, cameras flashing, reporters swarming, each one desperate to catch a glimpse of the faces behind the story already being spun as the ideological showdown of the decade. It wasn't just about law. It never is. It was about who gets to define truth when power is at stake. At the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, measured, deliberate. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she was the one everyone underestimated. The case itself was a knot of corruption and cowardice. A long-serving political figure, someone untouchable for years, had been accused of leveraging public funds to suppress investigations, twisting legal loopholes into personal shields. Every previous attempt to hold him accountable had collapsed under procedural noise. But this time was different. This time, a congresswoman with a background in civil rights law refused to look away. The cameras followed her as she stepped into the courthouse that morning. She didn't grandstand. She didn't smile for the press. She simply adjusted her folder beneath her arm and kept walking, her reflection trailing behind her in the polished marble floors. Around her, the whispers multiplied. Some dismissed her as a political opportunist. Others called her a rising star. Few, if any, predicted what she was about to do. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Rows of aides lined the back, whispering strategy like gamblers trading odds. Every corridor hummed with tension, clerks pacing, journalists refreshing feeds, legal analysts rehearsing sound bites. This wasn't just another hearing. It was a test of credibility, composure, and courage. And the contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side of the chamber sat the old guard, gray suits, silver hair, that smug brand of confidence that comes from never being challenged. They smiled like men who already knew the ending. On the other side sat Jasmine, alone at her desk, flipping through her notes. Every movement quiet, intentional. Her focus made their smirks look childish. The media called it a clash of generations, a war for the soul of justice, a battle between rhetoric and reason. But those who truly understood the stakes knew it was simpler than that. It was about integrity in a room where pretense had become tradition. Behind closed doors, some whispered that the case was symbolic, a gesture, not a fight anyone expected to win. But Crockett didn't see it that way. She saw the systems rot up close, and she knew how power protects itself, with delay, with arrogance, with doubt. She'd spent years learning how to pierce those defenses. As the hearing began, the cameras rolled, the nation tuned in, and the air itself seemed to tighten. Every statement from the defense dripped with condescension, a rehearsed mix of legalese and disdain. Every response from Crockett carried weight not in volume but in conviction. She spoke as if truth were a living thing sitting beside her, daring anyone to ignore it. Even Justice Roberts' face was unreadable then, eyes scanning the room like a man sensing a coming storm. The journalists would later write about the decorum, the interruptions, the tension. But what they missed was the current beneath it, all the quiet defiance building with every calm answer Jasmine gave. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming meaning. And as the defense leaned in, confident that their credentials would carry the day, they didn't realize the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. But beneath the legal jargon lay something far deeper, an attempt to silence the very principle she stood for. His name was everywhere. Senator Blake Reddington, the so-called architect of modern accountability. On paper, he was the embodiment of success. Ivy League educated, legacy connections stretching through 3 generations of privilege, his signature on half a dozen policies that looked noble from a distance and ruthless up close. He was the kind of man who believed the system worked because it had always worked for him. The cameras adored him. Every press conference was a performance, perfectly timed smirks, sound bites crafted for primetime consumption, and the practiced humility of a man allergic to genuine vulnerability. When reporters lobbed soft questions, he answered with self-assured charm. When someone dared to press harder, his eyes would harden just enough to remind them who held the mic. "Senator Reddington, any comment on the inquiry?" A journalist shouted once as he exited his car. He adjusted his cufflinks, smiled with that politician's precision, and replied, "Ah, yes, the circus of the week. I'll let the idealists have their headlines before we return to governing." Laughter followed. Cameras clicked. The clip went viral not because it was honest, but because arrogance has always been photogenic. Behind closed doors, his contempt ran deeper. Staffers whispered about his temper, his disdain for the unpolished, his habit of referring to female colleagues as sentimental when they dared to disagree. He surrounded himself with men who echoed his tone, ensuring the walls of his world were lined with approval. It was less a team than an echo chamber, one that rewarded loyalty and punished audacity. When the ethics inquiry began, Reddington barely blinked. "It'll blow over," he told his chief of staff, voice smooth with the assurance of someone who'd seen storms pass before. "They'll bark. I'll stay calm. Then we'll move on." He didn't even bother to read the full brief against him, the brief that bore Jasmine Crockett's name. He'd seen her on television before her speeches on justice reform, her fiery committee exchanges. "She's got energy," he once said with a smirk, "but she's not built for the long game." His circle laughed. "Too emotional," one aide muttered. "Too ambitious," said another. The consensus was unanimous. She'd flare up, trend for a week, and fade back into the background noise of Washington's endless theater. What they didn't understand was that passion, when rooted in purpose, doesn't burn out. It burns through. Still, Reddington didn't notice the shift. As the investigation gained traction, his press appearances grew bolder. He framed himself as the victim of performative politics. He invoked history, patriotism, the erosion of civility. Words meant to sound wise but designed to dismiss. The press ate it up. The old guard nodded approvingly, and the machine of arrogance rolled on, confident in its immunity. He'd built his career on that immunity, on knowing the right donors, controlling the right narratives, and wielding charm like armor. When hearings loomed, he viewed them not as accountability but as opportunities. Each appearance was stagecraft, each rebuttal rehearsed. Truth was negotiable, perception was not. Yet beneath the polish, a subtle panic had begun to take root. He'd seen the data polls tightening, commentary shifting, whispers in the cloakroom. "Crockett's different," one junior aide dared to say. Reddington's jaw tightened. "Different how?" "She doesn't take the bait," came the reply. He waved it off. "Then she'll be easy to box in." But arrogance blinds more effectively than ignorance ever could. In the weeks before the hearing, he prepared the way he always had through control. He met with sympathetic journalists, framed the narrative as a witch hunt, and dismissed the inquiry as a rookie's attempt at relevance. His tone was casual, but the undertone was venom. He didn't just doubt Jasmine Crockett, he disrespected her very presence in the room. In his world, people like her were supposed to stay grateful, to smile at power, not confront it, to take notes, not issue them. He didn't see her as an equal. He saw her as an interruption, and that was his first mistake. When the morning of the hearing arrived, he entered the chamber like a man stepping onto a familiar stage. Cameras followed every stride. His supporters filled the seats behind him, faces smug with confidence. He nodded, waved, smiled, every movement rehearsed, every glance calculated. Then, as he took his seat, he looked across the aisle and met Jasmine Crockett's gaze. No hostility, no fear, just composure. The kind of quiet that unnerves men who rely on noise. He looked away. First, the irony of it all, the machinery of arrogance. Humming beneath chandeliers of justice was that Reddington truly believed he couldn't lose. He mistook entitlement for inevitability. He'd written her off before she ever spoke, certain that brilliance could be overshadowed by bluster. They thought they'd already written her ending. But Jasmine was about to rewrite the script. Long before the marble halls and televised hearings, Jasmine Crockett learned what silence could do. She grew up in a neighborhood where the sound of ambition often got drowned out by the noise of survival. Her mother, a nurse who worked nights, used to tell her, "Baby, speak softly but make sure they still hear you." Those words became her compass, even when the world pretended not to listen. In school, she was the quiet one who paid attention while others underestimated her. Teachers said she was bright, but too intense. Classmates rolled their eyes when she corrected the civics teacher about constitutional procedure. It didn't matter. She wasn't chasing attention, she was chasing understanding. Law wasn't just a dream to her, it was armor. When she first walked into law school, she felt the weight of eyes on her, curious, skeptical, some outright dismissive. The whispers followed her through hallways lined with portraits of men who'd never had to prove they belonged. "Diversity quota," one student muttered once, not realizing she could hear him. She did. And she remembered. Those years hardened her resolve. She learned that intellect alone wasn't enough. You had to carry it like fire-controlled, precise, but unyielding. Nights spent in the library, lit by fluorescent hum and stubborn willpower, became her proving ground. She studied cases like they were battle plans, dissected arguments until dawn, and rehearsed oral defenses under her breath while walking home through the cold. The first time she stood before a judge, she was met not with curiosity, but condescension. The opposing counsel, a man twice her age with half her preparation, smirked as he interrupted her opening statement. "Counselor," he'd said, dripping mock politeness, "let's not get emotional." The courtroom chuckled. She paused, took a breath, and continued as if the comment had evaporated. But that night, she sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel, replaying every word. Humiliation has two choices. It can harden into anger or sharpen into focus. She chose focus. That moment became the foundation of her career. The lesson that calm wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Every bias she faced became data. Every sneer became fuel. She built her reputation case by case, brick by brick, earning respect not through outrage, but through precision. When others shouted, she dissected. When they gestured, she reasoned. Slowly, even her skeptics began to realize she didn't need to raise her voice to dominate a room. Yet the cost was heavy. In a system that rewards spectacle, restraint can feel invisible. She watched loud men advance faster, watched colleagues with half her skill charm their way into headlines. There were moments late at night, papers scattered, the hum of exhaustion pressing against her chest, when she wondered if quiet conviction could ever cut through the noise. Then came the case that changed everything. A wrongful conviction buried under bureaucratic neglect, a young man serving time for a crime the evidence couldn't sustain. No one wanted to touch it. Too messy, too politically inconvenient. But Jasmine took it. She spent months unearthing forgotten files, interviewing witnesses others dismissed, threading the story back to truth. When the exoneration finally came, the courtroom erupted in disbelief. She didn't smile. She just exhaled, steady and deliberate, as if justice had finally remembered itself. That victory caught attention. Suddenly, she wasn't just an attorney. She was a name whispered in political circles, admired in communities that had long felt unseen. People called her the calm storm. She didn't posture, didn't perform, but her words lingered long after she spoke them. Still, success never softened her. For every door opened, there were two more closed with a smile. Invitations to panels that excluded her voice. Debates where she was tokenized and ignored. Meetings where her ideas were praised only when repeated by someone else. Each slight left a scar, but also a reminder. Progress doesn't come from being accepted, it comes from being undeniable. So when the opportunity came to step into politics, she didn't hesitate. The stakes were higher, the audience broader, but the mission remained the same: to make the law serve the people who needed it most, not the ones who could afford it. Her campaign wasn't funded by power brokers, but by teachers, nurses, small business owners, the very people she'd fought for her entire life. In every debate, every hearing, she carried the lessons of those long nights and quiet humiliations. When opponents tried to bait her with insults, she smiled. When they talked over her, she waited. When they mocked her calm, she let them dig their own graves. Because composure in her hands was not restraint, it was control. And perhaps that's why, as the Senate chamber filled with tension that day, she appeared unbothered. Her expression gave nothing away. Those who didn't know her mistook it for detachment. Those who did recognized it for what it was: readiness. The same calm that once kept her overlooked was now her greatest weapon. She understood that the higher the volume of arrogance, the quieter truth had to speak to be heard. And she knew instinctively that power built on pretense always collapses under precision. So when her name appeared on the docket beside Senator Reddington's, she didn't see it as intimidation. She saw it as alignment. The universe had brought her to the exact moment she'd been preparing for all along. And when the nation's eyes turned on her once more, she didn't flinch, she prepared. The gavel struck once, sharp and final, cutting through the chatter. The hearing was in session. The room, packed to capacity, vibrated with anticipation, a collision of history and hubris, about to unfold beneath the vaulted ceiling. Reporters poised their pens, cameras blinked red, and in that glow of scrutiny, the old machinery of arrogance began to move. Senator Reddington's counsel rose first, every gesture rehearsed, his confidence dripping like oil. "Your Honors," he began, voice smooth, deliberate, too calm to be humble. "Let us remember that this case is not about theatrics. It's about facts, and my client's long-standing record of public service." He didn't glance at Jasmine Crockett, but his tone carried that subtle inflection reserved for women meant to feel small. He flooded the air with jargon, statutes, precedents, citations from cases older than half the room. It was a calculated assault, a linguistic smokescreen meant to dazzle the cameras and drown the truth. Crockett listened without blinking, pen still, eyes fixed. The microphones caught every rustle of his papers, every arrogant pause timed for applause that never came. Then came the interruptions. "If I may clarify," she began, but his voice barreled over hers, louder, smug. "In due time, Congresswoman," he said, feigning courtesy. Laughter rippled from the defense table. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Justice Roberts raised an eyebrow but didn't intervene. The game had begun. Each argument was a trap, deliberate misquotes of her prior statements, cherry-picked evidence stripped of context. His words filled the chamber like smoke, thick and choking. The crowd leaned forward, waiting to see if she would strike back, but she didn't. She stayed still, unshaken, letting his words hang in the air like static before a storm. Behind her calm exterior, she measured everything: the tone, the timing, the tremor in his confidence when he pushed too far. She wasn't reacting. She was studying. Every raised voice revealed more than it concealed. And in that silence, she built her counterstrike, one observation at a time. "Objection," her co-counsel murmured quietly beside her, but she lifted a hand, barely perceptible. Not yet. Reddington himself leaned back, watching, arms crossed, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. To him, this was confirmation, the girl from the neighborhood, the upstart congresswoman, out of her depth in the grand theater of power. He whispered to his aide, loud enough for the microphones to catch fragments. "Composure's not strategy. It's fear." The words hit the air like poison, subtle but lethal. The gallery tensed. Reporters scribbled. Justice Roberts' gavel didn't fall, but his expression hardened. Still, Jasmine said nothing. The hearing stretched on. The defense team paraded witnesses, invoked procedural loopholes, and filled the transcript with noise. Every few minutes, one of them would accidentally refer to her by the wrong title: Ms. Crockett, Miss, never Congresswoman. 1,000 little paper cuts, each designed to provoke, but she didn't give them the satisfaction. Her eyes never left the table before her, her pen tracing invisible notes across the margin of her file. The cameras caught her stillness, her breathing even, her focus absolute. It was the kind of composure that unnerved men built on bluster. The crowd began to shift. What started as skepticism began to morph into curiosity. A journalist in the front row whispered, "She's waiting for something." Another replied, "No, she's planning something." Even the senators on the bench began to sense it, the imbalance of noise and poise tilting slowly, inevitably. The defense's certainty began to sound like desperation. They were too loud, too defensive, too eager to prove what no one had challenged yet. Justice Roberts finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you wish to respond?" The room froze. For the first time all day, all eyes turned to her. She lifted her gaze, meeting the Chief Justice's eyes. Then, slowly, she closed her folder. The sound was soft, but it sliced through the room like a verdict. Reddington's smirk faltered, just slightly. The silence returned dense, electric, the kind that holds its breath before lightning strikes. And as Jasmine Crockett rose, her voice still unspoken, every camera zoomed in. Every journalist leaned forward. Every heartbeat seemed to stall in unison. Because everyone in that chamber knew, somehow, that the tone of the hearing was about to change forever. But when she finally spoke, every word cut through the noise like a blade. For a heartbeat, the entire courtroom hung in suspension. The air itself seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to breathe. Jasmine Crockett stood, the sound of her chair sliding back echoing sharper than any gavel. She didn't rush. She didn't adjust her notes. She simply looked around the room at the judges, at the press, at the men who had spent the last hour mistaking patience for weakness, and then finally, at Senator Reddington. He looked back with that familiar grin, the one polished for cameras, rehearsed for control. But this time, something flickered, barely noticeable, a crack in confidence. Jasmine's first words were quiet. "With all due respect, counsel," she began, "if we're here to discuss facts, then let's actually do that." The shift was instantaneous. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried measured, deliberate, resonant. The microphones didn't amplify her. They surrendered to her. Every syllable landed like a drop of water on stone, soft but relentless. She opened the folder in front of her, flipping once, twice, then holding up a single page. "You cited Article 14, subsection B," she said evenly, "to claim that discretionary funding is exempt from oversight in this instance. But the statute you're quoting from 1978 was superseded by the Public Integrity Amendment of 2003. The clause you built your entire argument on doesn't exist anymore." Gasps, a rustle in the gallery. Someone whispered, "She's right." The defense counsel blinked, lips parting, papers shuffling. Reddington's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "A misprint," he muttered to his aide, but Jasmine continued. Her voice was steady, but her precision was surgical. "You've also claimed that the financial transfers in question were routine. Yet Exhibit F, submitted by your own team, shows 12 payments processed through an intermediary who, coincidentally, shares a business address with your client's private foundation." She paused, letting the words breathe. "Routine transactions don't typically go through shell corporations," the audience murmured. Journalists leaned forward, fingers racing across keyboards. The rhythm of typing replaced the defense's earlier confidence. Every detail she spoke came like a blow wrapped in logic, impossible to deflect. Reddington's attorney tried to interrupt, but Justice Roberts raised a hand. "Let her finish," he said quietly. Crockett did not look away. "You've spent the morning insisting on tradition, on how things have always been done. But always is not the same as right. History doesn't excuse misconduct, it exposes it." The silence that followed was heavier than sound. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as though afraid to blink and miss a moment. Then she turned, addressing the bench directly. "This case isn't about one man. It's about a system that assumes accountability is optional when power feels comfortable. It's about the belief that certain people can't be questioned. That integrity is just a slogan for those who can't afford influence." Her voice rose only slightly, not in anger but in conviction, a crescendo of truth, not emotion. "I was raised to believe the law protects the people, not the powerful. And if that belief makes me naive in this room, then I'll wear that label proudly. Because the alternative is corruption disguised as experience." A low hum moved through the gallery, half gasp, half applause stifled by protocol. A reporter mouthed the words, "Oh my God." The defense counsel tried one last lifeline. "Congresswoman, I think you're misinterpreting." She cut him off without raising her tone. "No, I'm clarifying." Her hand slid another document across the table. "Page 12. Read it." He hesitated. "That's confidential." "It was," she replied smoothly, "until your client entered it into public record by mistake last month. You see, transparency isn't something you can file away when it's inconvenient." Laughter broke somewhere in the back row, quickly hushed. The senator's face flushed, that confident smirk dissolving into the color of realization. Jasmine stepped forward, voice soft again. "You've built your defense on privilege. I built mine on preparation. You came here expecting to be respected. I came here knowing it had to be earned." Justice Roberts leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing not in disapproval, but in awe. The Chief Justice's expression had shifted from scrutiny to admiration. It wasn't just her logic. It was the poise with which she wielded it. Crockett looked down at her papers, closed them slowly, and then addressed the bench one last time. "If we allow this level of deceit to pass as governance, we teach every young person watching that ethics are negotiable. That truth depends on who can afford it. And I refuse to let that be the lesson they learn from us." A pause. Long, measured, electric. Then she stepped back, returning to her seat. For a moment, no one spoke. The defense attorney stared blankly at the desk before him. Reporters' fingers hesitated over their keyboards, unsure how to summarize what had just happened. The crowd sat frozen in disbelief. And then, without prompting, without applause, Justice Roberts nodded. One slow, deliberate motion. Not ceremony, not sympathy, respect. Every camera caught it. That quiet nod. That wordless endorsement that meant more than any ruling could. The moment spread like fire through the chamber, through the country. It was subtle enough to be dignified, but powerful enough to be history. Reddington shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes downcast. He wasn't defeated by force. He was undone by truth delivered so calmly it left no room for denial. The arrogance that once filled the room had evaporated, replaced by something heavier. Awareness. Jasmine didn't look at him again. She didn't need to. The battle was over. The moment silence became her ally. A soft voice from the gallery broke the quiet. "She did it," someone whispered. Another voice, trembling with awe, followed. "She's right." The murmur rippled outward across the benches, through the reporters, through the marble corridors beyond the chamber. Cameras clicked, pens scratched. History documented itself. Crockett gathered her notes, straightened the edge of her file, and set her pen down. The small, deliberate act felt final, like the closing of a book no one else had the courage to write. Justice Roberts cleared his throat. "This court will recess." His tone carried something rare, something that sounded almost like pride. As the gavel fell, the audience exhaled, as if they'd all been holding the same breath for too long. The defense team avoided her eyes. Reddington rose slowly, the weight of silence heavier than any verdict. Jasmine walked out of the chamber with the same composure she entered, with no smile, no triumph, just quiet certainty. Her calm had once been mistaken for passivity. Now it looked like power. Outside, the flash of cameras ignited the steps in light. Questions flew like confetti. How did you know? Did you expect the justice's reaction? What happens next? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The footage would speak louder than any quote could. Because in a single afternoon, Jasmine Crockett had turned restraint into revolution. And across the nation, millions of viewers would soon replay this moment, the nod, the silence, the truth slicing through noise until it became legend. But the shockwaves didn't stop at the courtroom door. The clip hit the internet before the gavel's echo faded. Within an hour, it was everywhere, spliced, captioned, slowed down for dramatic effect. The moment Justice Roberts nodded, the moment Jasmine Crockett closed her folder, the silence that followed it all became instant myth. The world didn't just watch it, it felt it. By evening, hashtags flooded the feed. Crockett effect. Truth in silence. Tojinsha, respect earned. Millions of posts poured in. From policy wonks to high school students, from civil rights icons to comedians on late-night shows. One tweet, simple and viral, read, "You don't need to shout when the facts do it for you." Cable news anchors replayed the footage on loop. The screen split into panels, commentators gesturing, voices overlapping, everyone trying to decode how one woman dismantled an empire without raising her tone. It wasn't anger, one analyst said. It was authority. Real authority, the kind that doesn't demand the room's respect. It commands it. Even ideological opponents couldn't look away. A conservative pundit, visibly uneasy, admitted on air, "I disagree with almost everything she stands for, but that was mastery." The clip of him saying it got more views than his entire show that week. TikTok flooded with edits, slow-motion montages of Crockett's calm expression, set to orchestral swells, captions reading, "Composure is power," and "Justice doesn't always roar." College students mimicked her lines for debate club inspiration. Law professors paused mid-lecture to play her rebuttal as an example of discipline under fire. A video from a small-town classroom went viral overnight. A civics teacher stood by a projector showing Crockett's speech. The students, normally restless, sat in silence, leaning forward, eyes wide. When it ended, one girl whispered, "She sounds like my mom when she's had enough." The class laughed softly, but the teacher didn't. "That," she said, "is what democracy's supposed to look like." Across social media, tributes mixed with disbelief. Artists painted her face in chiaroscuro, the calm storm in grayscale. Activists quoted her line about history and right, threading it into movements already simmering. Journalists called it a turning point in political communication, a masterclass in dignity that cut through a decade of shouting. The late-night monologues arrived next. One host smirked before playing the footage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "for once in American politics, someone used facts like fireworks." The crowd roared, laughter melting into applause as the clip rolled. Even the punchlines that followed felt like praise disguised as comedy. Meanwhile, on cable reruns and YouTube recaps, Reddington's smirk became a meme, the "before humility" template, spreading faster than any press statement could contain. His silence in that final moment became its own commentary. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were vindicated. They'd seen arrogance fall, and it had felt like justice. But amid the noise, what resonated most wasn't her words. It was her stillness. Commentators said it out loud. She didn't perform, she revealed. The kind of truth that doesn't trend often enough in a country addicted to spectacle. By midnight, journalists were calling it the most pivotal hearing of the decade. Polling analysts noted a spike in public trust for congressional ethics oversight. Young viewers who'd never watched a hearing in their lives were suddenly quoting case law in comment threads. Clips of her closing line, If We Allow Deceit to Pass as Governance, were sampled into songs, speeches, and digital billboards. In one viral post, an elderly woman filmed herself watching the footage from her kitchen table, tears streaking her cheeks. "I've waited my whole life," she said softly, "to see someone talk to them like that and not get swallowed by it." Even the White House press briefing couldn't avoid the topic. A journalist asked the press secretary if the president had seen the exchange. She smiled faintly. "He did," she said, "and let's just say he nodded too." The room laughed, but the implication was clear. The ripple had reached the highest office. By morning, major newspapers led with the same image: Crockett standing tall, folder closed, the faint outline of Justice Roberts behind her, mid-nod. The headline varied slightly, but the sentiment was identical. Dignity strikes back. And while networks scrambled to chase the story, something deeper stirred beneath the trending metrics. The country, long divided by noise, had paused together in rare, collective silence, not because they all agreed, but because they recognized truth when they heard it: calm, unembellished, undeniable. The shockwaves didn't just move through media. They seeped into conversations at dinner tables, into classrooms, into quiet corners of workplaces. Parents replayed the clip for their children. Mentors shared it with interns. Ministers quoted it from pulpits. It became shorthand for integrity, pull a Crockett, a new American idiom for grace under fire. And yet, beneath the applause, Jasmine remained distant from the noise. She hadn't posted a response, hadn't given interviews. Her silence became its own statement. The nation waited, refreshing feeds, speculating. Because even in a world addicted to words, her restraint had become the loudest message of all. But Jasmine's real victory wasn't in trending. It was in what happened the next morning. The sun rose on Washington with a kind of hush that felt earned. The air outside Jasmine Crockett's office was cooler, quieter, almost reverent. Reporters still lingered near the marble steps, waiting for a quote, a soundbite, a glimpse, but inside, she sat alone for the first time in days. The light filtered through half-closed blinds, laying stripes across the table where her papers still sat, untouched since the hearing. She hadn't slept much. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the simple weight of reality. Victories, she knew, don't always feel victorious. They're quieter, heavier, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. She sipped cold coffee and stared at the file one last time before closing it for good. The case was technically unfinished, the verdict still pending, but in the court of public conscience, the decision had already been rendered. Integrity had won a round. Her phone vibrated constantly, messages from colleagues, strangers, students, mentors, old friends. Some just sent hearts, others full paragraphs about how they'd shown the clip to their children. But Jasmine didn't answer any of them. Not yet. Instead, she stood, stretching the stiffness from her shoulders, and walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, chaotic, proud, flawed, alive. Somewhere out there, a new headline was already being written. Somewhere, another debate was being staged. But for this brief moment, there was calm. Outside, people walked with a new sense of conversation in their eyes. 2 young interns passed by her building, phones out, replaying the clip again. "She didn't even raise her voice," one said. The other nodded. "Yeah, she didn't have to." Jasmine smiled faintly. That was the point. The narrator's voice cuts in not as commentary, but as reflection. Sometimes, dignity doesn't roar, it endures. It waits. It absorbs every insult, every dismissal, every sneer, and turns them into fuel for clarity. In a country that too often mistakes noise for strength, composure has become rebellion. Jasmine's calm wasn't passivity. It was defiance in its most elegant form. She showed a nation what restraint can do when wielded by someone who refuses to be diminished. That's the paradox of power. It doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to stand. And in that stillness, America saw itself. The teacher who holds her tongue until the lesson lands. The nurse who keeps working while chaos erupts around her. The immigrant father who faces a room full of doubt, but still speaks softly because truth is already loud enough. The students who study late into the night, believing intellect still matters in a world addicted to performance. For every person who has ever been talked over, underestimated, or dismissed, Jasmine's moment became a mirror. A quiet promise that composure doesn't mean surrender, it means mastery. As she stepped out of her office into the hallway, staffers looked up from their screens. Some smiled. Some simply nodded, the way people do when words feel too small. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Her presence carried the message. Down the corridor, the sound of her footsteps echoed, faintly measured, unhurried, each one a punctuation mark, in a sentence she'd been writing her entire life. When she pushed open the heavy door to the street, the morning light greeted her like a verdict. Somewhere, a passerby recognized her and clapped softly. Others joined, not a standing ovation, but something better: acknowledgement. The kind of recognition that can't be choreographed. Jasmine nodded once in return, her smile small but steady. Then she walked forward into the day, leaving the noise behind. The narrator's voice returns, low and reverent. Sometimes the loudest sound in America is silence, the kind that follows truth. The camera lingers on the empty courtroom, the sunlight pooling where she once stood, the faint echo of Justice Roberts' nod, still reverberating through marble and memory. But this story isn't over, because truth, once heard, echoes. They called it the moment that silenced the chamber. The day Justice Roberts applauded Jasmine Crockett's brilliance wasn't just a legal triumph, it became a national mirror, reflecting what people still long to see in power: humility that commands respect, intellect that doesn't need to shout, and grace that wins without cruelty. In a world addicted to noise, her calm had become revolutionary. Across the country, people replayed that nod from the Chief Justice, not as ceremony, but as validation proof that integrity still moves mountains, even in rooms built to resist it. Jasmine didn't win because she was loud. She won because she was right, and she carried truth like a lantern through darkness. That's the legacy of respect. Not domination, but quiet influence. Not humiliation, but understanding. The kind of strength that doesn't crumble under arrogance, but dismantles it with composure. And as viewers, as citizens, as witnesses to this moment, we're part of that story now. Because every time we choose empathy over ego, facts over fury, and dignity over division, we keep that light alive. So if this story moved, you share it. Let it travel farther than anger ever could. Subscribe not just to this channel, but to the idea that truth still matters, and that leadership grounded in respect isn't old-fashioned, it's essential. The screen fades to black. The echo of footsteps trails off in the marble hall. Then her voice returns, soft, steady, certain. Respect isn't given. It's earned in silence. A pause. Then the faint sound of applause, not thunderous, but honest. The kind that lingers. The kind that reminds us, composure is power, and truth, when spoken with grace, always finds its echo.